come to meet each other and collaborate on this such an interesting story?
I had actually started researching this story 17 years ago now. And in the beginning, I didn't even know that it would be a book or that there would be enough of a discovery to make a book. But once I had decided that this was a story that needed to be told and I needed to have a really great writer at my side, Tiffany and I had met years before. Tell us about that, Tiff.
Yeah, so I was working with another team who was doing a book about the Culper Spy Ring, and we pulled together just sort of a casual symposium almost of Long Island historians. And so we had a number of people there, and Claire was one of them. And everyone was so impressed with her encyclopedic knowledge of the era and the time of the Culper Spy Ring and the just Long Island history in general. And so we had stayed in touch for a number of years after that. And so she gave me a call one day. Actually, it was right at the end of my maternity leave. And so we often kind of joke that we can talk about the actual book part. There was, years of research leading up to this phone call that she did. But in terms of our collaboration, that we can kind of align it with my daughter who's now in first grade. So you get a sense of that time passage. And
Perfect.
Project that.
Well, let me welcome folks. Good evening. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston. And joining me from Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. 2 quick notes as we get started. This is our last discussion of the year, as you know, and at the end we're going to do something special, so hope you'll hang on with us for that. And then tonight we have lots of maps that we're going to be showing, so you may want to enlarge your screen so that you can see those better. Now, we are excited to welcome Claire Bellerjeau and Tiffany Yecke Brooks. Claire formerly served as historian and director of education at Liz's birthplace, Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, New York. She has been researching the Townsend family and those they enslaved for over 17 years. She has developed educational programs on the subjects of slavery in New York and the American Revolution on Long Island. She is also establishing a 501c3 nonprofit organization called Remember Liz, with the mission to educate the community about the extraordinary life and times of an enslaved Black woman from New York named Elizabeth or Liz. Tiffany has spoken and published widely on early portrayals of race in transatlantic performance, as well as the emerging American identity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She was a lead researcher and contributing writer for the New York Times bestselling George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, and Andrew Jackson and the Miracle at New Orleans, among others. They are co-writers of Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, the True Story of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth, which we look forward to discussing tonight. Thank you for joining us, Claire and Tiffany.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
Well, what an interesting story. And I think, and just as we were kind of getting going, the characterization of here's one figure that probably everyone or most everyone knows from the Revolution, and here's a figure that probably no one in our audience tonight has heard of. So this will be really fascinating. Why don't you give us some background and help us understand what was going on with slavery during that revolutionary period, and perhaps the difference at that time between slavery in the North versus the South.
Mm-hmm. Most people, when they think of the topic of slavery in America, they just instantly think of the South. And a lot of people also just instantly think of the Civil War. And that's really what we were taught in school. And, so it's no wonder that that's what we think. But actually, as I was beginning to do this research, it really became so clear to me that slavery was something that had happened from the very beginning of life here in what's now America, and that there was legal slavery in every one of the 13 colonies. So why don't you bring up this one graphic that I provided about 1770 and how much slavery there was in that year. Liz would have been about 7 years old or so. And so if you look at that red bar, that's the northern colonies, the colonies above Maryland. And so if you look at the numbers there, New York had overwhelmingly the most slavery of any northern colony. And in fact, if you added up all the New England colonies, New York still had way more than Pennsylvania, which was kind of geographically the same size. And if you look at the very bottom, even more than Georgia in 1770. And so that was a real shock to me. And it's something that we should remember up here in the North, that New York was the epicenter of slavery at that time in the North.
Roughly 40% of households in New York City would have had an enslaved person in them, which is really a surprising statistic because, again, as Claire said, we tend to think of it in such binary terms of this was a Southern issue and the North was free, but the North wasn't always free. And so it really, it kind of complicates some of those ideas. But I think it's important to understand that setting as we go into the rest of the story to realize just how widespread the practice of slavery really was throughout the colonies.
There were a lot of runaway slave ads in every edition of the paper in New York at that time. But if you think about it from the enslaved person's point of view, where exactly were you going to go when you escaped? Because every colony had slavery by law.
Well, let's bring in the character, the individual that's pretty well known, especially to people who are passionate about the Revolution, Robert Townsend. Talk to us about Robert Townsend and background, and then the role that we know him for in the Revolution.
Yeah, he was born around 1753, and he was born into a very wealthy, well-to-do, very patriotic family. Their name was Townsend, and his father, Samuel Townsend, was like a civic leader in Oyster Bay on Long Island, town clerk, town justice of the peace. And his father had joined the New York Provincial Congress in 1775, which were really a group of founding figures trying to plan the Revolutionary War from a New York perspective. So Robert grew up in this world of wealth and privilege and also civic mindedness. And after we lost Long Island and Manhattan to the British, he and his family remained behind enemy lines, which was pretty unusual since they were so well known as patriots that they would not have fled. And so he was kind of in this perfect position in Manhattan as a merchant. His family had made their money as shipping merchants. He had a store in Lower Manhattan, so he had access to a lot of information from that position. And he became Culper Jr., one of the lead anchor spies in a group called the Culper Spy Ring. And he was the one at the place where all the information was, British headquarters, gathering that information and funneling it out all the way out onto Long Island to get to Washington. And so he was a very interesting figure.
Two of the things that I think are interesting about the book is, well, first of all, there are a number of misconceptions about Robert that have been out there over the years. For example, the idea that he was a Quaker, and what Claire's research has shown is that there's no indication of that whatsoever. And actually, his family names show up in the Baptist church register. So we're correcting some of those misunderstandings from history. But part of what's interesting too is I think so often when we think of these figures from the Revolutionary War, the founding figures, we tend to think of them during this like 6-year period, or maybe a little longer leading up to the war and then the war. But what's so interesting is that we trace Robert's story beyond the Revolutionary War. That really was just a few years of his life. And there is so much more of who he became after the war that we cover in this book. And so I think for people who are interested in the Culper Ring or about the people who made up the Culper Ring, this is, sort of an interesting read because you learn more about the individuals beyond just, a few years that they spent in the Revolution.
Boy, I'd love to give your audience a tease too. I bet a lot of the people watching saw the series Turn, which was on AMC and then got onto Netflix. You better read our book if you're interested in John Graves Simcoe, because you're going to have quite a surprise when you find out that super villain actually was nothing like how he was portrayed.
Well, that'll be the first time that a dramatic portrayal did not match the historical.
Right.
So let's introduce then the other individual, Elizabeth, or Liz, and I believe that's her portrait that you have over your shoulder there.
Yes, this is a portrait of her, which is not really a portrait of her. So an enslaved person would not have been able to sit for their portrait in their own lifetime. And so I worked with an artist of today and explained to her Liz's life and what we can know about her. And this is an artist's interpretation of her. But I think that it's important for us to have a visual, for us to have a way to understand what Liz might have looked like and a way to connect with her better. She was born about 10 years after Robert. So he was about 10 years old when she was born, and she was enslaved by his family. And so the world that she was born into, she may have lived in the home of a wealthy family, but she was living in a much different circumstance where, enslaved people were being whipped and punished at a whipping post. Enslaved people might be shackled. They would be punished if they ran away. And while we don't have instances of that happening specifically to her or in her household, it was her world, a world where she had no free will. And, she was encountering some interesting people along the way. The Revolutionary War happened to enslaved people too. And so now they were working overtime, as it were, not just doing the regular work that they did, but now their household itself became occupied. And in the case of this family, not just any old soldier billeted in their house, but the commanders of regiments. So when a regiment would come into Oyster Bay as just R&R for the winter, let's say, like a 6-month period, the regimental soldiers would be scattered throughout the town, but their commander would billet in the house where she was enslaved. And so she had extra close contact, not only to this commander, Colonel Simcoe, that I mentioned, but to the British spy master, John Andre. You may have heard of him too. So it was a very unusual situation where Liz lived.
Yes.
What did I leave out, Tiffany?
Well, do we want to get to the first big instance that we see of how Liz kind of jumps into her story?
Yeah, maybe we want to go there. Can we get into what's so special about what happened to her?
Absolutely.
So here's this Commander Simcoe. He is the commander of a big British regiment, but he's also an early abolitionist, which is a pretty amazing thing to be in an era when slavery was legal in England and legal in every one of the 13 colonies. He believed slavery was morally wrong. After the war, he would be the one responsible for ending slavery in Canada. So if you want to jump ahead to the Civil War era and the Underground Railroad, the end of that railroad, the station you were trying to get to, was the place where he had ended slavery in Canada. But now we're going to go back into the Revolutionary War. And in 1779, when he left that household, Liz escaped with him. And so she escaped with this regiment of 350 men called the Queen's Rangers. And there's an amazing letter that the spy son Robert writes to his father after that escape. And it's just an incredible document that we still have that gives us a window into this incident of her escape. He actually tells his father not to try to get her back, which is pretty fascinating. Typically, of course, you would immediately try to get back your runaway slave by posting a runaway slave ad in the paper. But Robert instead says to his father, "Don't even try, you'll never get her back." And then later we find out he knew right where she was and he had contact with her. Because she didn't keep going with the regiment, she was re-enslaved in New York City, right where Robert had his store. And coincidentally, right when he became the lead spy, Culper Jr. So it's a pretty incredible little set of circumstances as she meets this man, Colonel Simcoe. He helps her escape. Robert becomes the lead spy, and she is now enslaved right near him in Lower Manhattan.
And I think it's worth mentioning, too, that the Queen's Rangers were in Oyster Bay for, it was roughly a 6-month span that they stayed there. So this wasn't a short stopover. They really wintered there and stayed through the spring. So she had a very long time to get to know Simcoe, to know what kind of person he was, and to make whatever these plans are. So in the book, we actually lay out 3 different scenarios that are possible because we don't know the exact circumstances of how she escaped. So did she escape with Simcoe? Simcoe knew, but did she escape and he was the only one who knew? Did she escape and Robert knew? Or did she escape and Simcoe,
Robert and Samuel.
Robert and then his father were also aware? And again, these are all very interesting possibilities. And as you go through the letters, you could see how any one of them could potentially
be the case.
Be the case, right?
Mhm.
But it's just fascinating that there are no runaway slave ads run searching for her in any newspapers in the months that follow her escape. So it makes you think that if the Townsends weren't aware of this and she just straight escaped, why wouldn't they have been searching for her? So that's what really kind of is tantalizing about this. And then, as Claire said, she suddenly shows up in the logbooks of Robert's shop in Manhattan.
Yeah. He purchased a few things for her during the time when he was a spy. So he definitely was in touch with her at that time. Now, the other really interesting thing that happened right at that same time, right after she entered Manhattan and started living there enslaved by a British officer, is the mention of a female spy using the Culper code number. So the Culper spies were gathering information for George Washington, and they didn't want to get caught, because if you got caught, the punishment was death by hanging. So they didn't want that to happen. And one of the ways that they kept their messages secret was by using a numeric code. So the American spy master Benjamin Talmadge had gotten a dictionary, written out all the words that were important in alphabetical order, and then assigned them each a number so that the spies could use that number in the place of the word. And we still have over 190 of these Culper letters in existence. Most of them are in the Library of Congress. But only one of them mentions 355. Now, if you're watching a lot of movie trailers right now, you're going to see a movie called The 355. Yeah. It's alluding to this female spy. And a lot of people in the past have thought that this was a fancy, wealthy, socially connected woman. But if you think about the timing and what would have been actually helpful to Robert, I would like to propose that that lady who would help the spies and who would outwit them all, as it said in this letter, could possibly be Liz. You know, spies are sneaky. You're never going to really know. But I would like to put Liz's name up at the top of the list of who 355 might be, because she had a great opportunity to gather intel. She was, in effect, invisible as an enslaved person.
And it's very curious to think, if she had run away from the Townsend family to get away from them, why would she suddenly show back up in Robert Townsend's shop? If she was trying to break those ties. So it's, again, we can't know for sure. And, we love the possibility of it, but we can't prove it, because, again, the nature of spies are that you cover your tracks and you should leave no sign. If you did your job well, you should be untraceable. But you have to wonder why she went into Robert's shop if she was trying to completely cut ties with the Townsends and not let them know where she was. And it's so significant to us that she is showing up in Robert's logbook at the same time that he has this female informant.
If we could bring up the graphic of Robert's shop locations in Manhattan, I think history lovers are going to just be super interested in why Robert Townsend changed his shop location mid-war. So if you look at the yellow circle more in the center of the page, that's an area of Lower Manhattan you can still visit called Hanover Square. If you've ever been to Fraunces Tavern in New York City, you could just walk right up Stone Street and you'd be in Hanover Square today. And that's a big hub, a place where a lot of shops were at that time, kind of in the center of the action. Robert moved his shop way over to Peck Slip, the other yellow circle more on the side of the page there. And he did that when Benedict Arnold came to town. So Benedict Arnold switched sides in 1780. And poor John Andre, the man that Liz actually knew, was caught up in that web of turning over the fort at West Point for money. He was put to death by hanging as a spy by George Washington. And Benedict Arnold got away and came to live down here in Manhattan that was all controlled by the British. He started rounding up spies almost immediately, and Benedict Arnold rounded up as many as 40 suspected American spies. One of them was the spy Hercules Mulligan, who you might remember from the musical Hamilton. In any case, Robert did not want to get rounded up, and so he left town. He may even have come back to his parents' house. for a nice 3 months, he was out of commission. And when he returned back, that was when he moved his shop over to the other location at Peckslip, which is near South Street Seaport, if you've ever visited Manhattan. And then at the end of the war, Liss again knew where he was. So how did Liss know that he had moved his shop, except that she had contact with him? And her British enslaver was now going to evacuate to Canada, and Liss did not want to go with him. So she came to Robert at his Peckslip apartment and asked him to buy her back. Can you imagine? She actually had a lot of agency, if you think about it. Right? Talk a little bit about that, Tiffany.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we see Liss advocating on behalf of herself, and she was actually pregnant at this time and on behalf of her unborn child. And so it's as the British were all selling out, moving up to Canada, she said, I don't want to go to Canada. We don't know her exact reasons, but we do know she still had family in Oyster Bay. She had a sister there, for example. And so then she actually sought Robert out and said, could you please repurchase me?
Now,
this is very interesting.
That child is described as mulatto by Robert.
Right. That's the wording he uses. Yeah. So we don't actually know who, it says her then master. So we don't know if this is her British master or if it was actually Robert himself. That is not made clear. But we do know that the child was biracial. And so it's fascinating to see that she is actually speaking up on her own behalf, and rather than saying, well, I have to go wherever this British master is, because even though she ran away with the British, at some point she was sold then to a British officer.
And she also was appealing to Robert at a time in his life when he had begun to believe slavery was immoral himself. So a lot of people know of him just as the spy, Culper Jr., but what you'll find out in our book is that he was a much more complicated person. He had this shop with an apartment above. He had his little brother William living there with him and his cousin, and they all worked together in the shop. But he actually paid a white servant, a woman named Polly Banvard, to come and keep house for them. And so when he brought Liss into the apartment and she had this child, a young son named Harry, he may not have wanted to own a slave at all. He would later join an anti-slavery movement called the New York Manumission Society. And so when the baby is about 6 months old, again, because Liss is on board with the idea, he resells the two of them to a woman they know who is recently widowed named Anne Sharwin, a middle-aged woman whose husband just had a heart attack and unexpectedly passed away. And so he makes a deal with this widow woman that if she should ever want to leave Manhattan, she needs to come and tell Robert so he can again take Liss in under his wing. And so that sale happens. Liss and Harry are now living with this widow, and Robert is off trying to collect his lost debts from the war, and the widow remarried. So the man she remarried was another wealthy merchant. And it's interesting. His name was Alexander Robertson. And there's actually a private school in Manhattan that still exists today that he founded, the Alexander Robertson School, still there. Any case, something occurred right away where he did something to Liss that caused a derangement and separation in his new marriage. And the marriage effectively ended as soon as it began. He kept baby Harry in New York City. Harry was about 2 at that time. And he sold Liss south to Charleston without her child. So Robert had no idea that had happened. And Liss was actually in Charleston, enslaved by a terrible man named Richard Palms for 2 years without her son before Robert found out.
And now Richard...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it. And to understand, I mean, it's horrible at all to imagine this woman being separated from her child, but the character of Richard Palms is this, he's just like written to be a villain. So he was one of the instigators at the Boston Massacre. Then he served as basically like a hired muscle for John Adams for a while, actually. Then he served as a Continental Marine during the Revolution, but was constantly getting in trouble with his superiors and like burning his commission and swearing at everyone and getting put in the brig. And he just all sorts of, trouble. And then we see, it's actually kind of fascinating that we know exactly what his home was furnished with in terms of like these mahogany tables and this, that, because he was constantly in debt. And so when there is like a selling of his estate or things get reclaimed by the bank, we actually have these detailed lists. So we actually know how his home was furnished. But all of that to say, he was not a kind and gentle man.
Yeah.
This was a man who had a violent history. He had a very brash temper. And so it's not just that Liz was separated from her child. That's horrible enough, but she was separated and sold down to Charleston to this violent man.
And when Robert did, go ahead, Lee.
Let me catch up with a couple of things. What do you think was going on where there was the transaction with the woman who was widowed? What was the rationale there?
We don't know the rationale per se, except we do know that Robert was against slavery. And we also know that he was in this bachelor's apartment with his little brother and his young cousin, male cousin. So maybe it just wasn't the atmosphere. Liz may not have wanted to live there. Maybe she wanted to have another independent situation, or it could go in another direction. I've sometimes wondered, did they have some kind of a falling out? Did they have a disagreement? We don't know. But he did agree to sell her to this other woman. And he did kind of take his eye off the ball. And you see later how much he regretted that, because after 2 years, he somehow stumbled upon the information that this had happened to her. And he went to this man's house, interrogated him, got all the information of what happened to Liz out of this guy, Alexander Robertson. And he physically stole baby Harry, who's now 4, took him out of the household, like carried him out, without paying for him, which was illegal, of course.
Yeah, the child
to the parents' house in Oyster Bay.
Right. Yeah, because Harry would have the child would have belonged to the owner. So when he purchased Liz, Harry was part of that deal, and so Harry legally belonged to
Robertson.
To Robertson, and Robert, in this confrontation, once he found out that Liz had been sold without his knowledge, in violation of the contract that he had set, he actually, like Claire said, physically removed little Harry from the home and took him back to Oyster Bay.
And when was it that, year-wise, when was it that he finally then shows up on the doorstep in Charleston looking for Liz?
Well, he didn't actually physically go to Charleston. He didn't go down there personally. So the year that she was sold south was 1785. And that was also the year that he joined the New York Manumission Society without knowing that she'd been sold south. And then she was down there for 2 years. So the spring and early summer of 1787 is when he found out she was down there and started writing a series of letters to some people who he knew were part of the abolitionist movement and also were merchants that his brother knew. His older brother, sold iron to these men. And so he had this existing relationship with them. And initially, the first 2 people that he asked to help didn't help him. So then he sought out a third person who was not just a friend through business, but a very close family friend. And that man, Alexander Gilchrist, said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And so another funny twist is that the abolitionist group he belonged to had failed to end slavery in New York. They could not get the votes to do that. But in the 2 years that Liz was in Charleston, they had succeeded in passing another law, a law that forbade slaves to cross state lines into New York. So while she was there being enslaved by this brutal man, a law was passed prohibiting her return.
And that was what complicated this issue. So the first people that Robert wrote to asking for their assistance, they were Quaker. One of them was, but they said
they were both Quaker.
Yeah, they were both Quaker. Okay. And they said, while we do not agree with slavery, we cannot assist you because this would require us to purchase a slave. And so it violated their principles. So it seems complicated because you can see how he would think, oh, these Quaker individuals, these would be great people to help me bring this woman home. And they said, no, this would require us to purchase it. So it actually goes against our beliefs.
And one of the men kind of backpedals, and he
Yes.
does help Adam Gilchrist in the end.
Yes.
There's all kinds of crazy little family connections involved in that story too.
Exactly. And the brother, actually, Robert's brother, Samuel, who Claire mentioned earlier, who has this anchor shop, he has a whole interesting bit that we get into in the book too, where he actually meets with Benjamin Franklin over in France.
Yeah.
After he has been forced to sail for the British. So it's so interesting because all of these characters who we know kind of get woven into the story in different places.
We called those Forrest Gump movements.
Yes.
Forrest Gump
He
moments.
touches
when we
on
were
these
writing the book.
historical
You just
figures.
wouldn't believe it. It almost sounds like there's only 10 people alive back
Right.
then. How do all these disparate characters actually cross paths like that? But they did.
And what's amazing too is that the ship that took, I'm sorry, Lee, were you going to?
No,
Well, I was just going to say, so she's down in Charleston,
Yeah.
and eventually Robert receives some help,
Yeah.
and then take us from there.
So we do believe that she did get back to Oyster Bay.
But they would have had to smuggle her back.
Yeah, they probably had to smuggle her back. But this man who was helping owned some merchant vessels. So it wouldn't have been so hard for him to smuggle Liz onto one of his vessels. And Oyster Bay has a very private harbor. They could have brought her right into that harbor and nobody would have been the wiser. And so I found a record that I believe is her in 1789 in Oyster Bay in the Baptist church rolls, where Samuel Townsend's name and his wife and daughter Sally can be found. And it just lists Elizabeth, a Black woman, but she's listed directly across the line from Samuel Townsend. And so tracking people that don't have a last name is definitely difficult.
Sure.
You can't always prove definitively because they just don't have enough records. But I think that is her. And then I also think that we can find her in the first federal census of 1790, listed as a free person working in a household called Fort Neck House, which was this beautiful mansion on the south shore of the town of Oyster Bay in a town that's now called Massapequa. And she was, I believe, a paid servant of a wealthy man named David Richard Floyd Jones. So that's another long and complicated story, but I believe that is her.
That's really fascinating. We've talked about this great story. I'm also fascinated at how you were able to put this story together in your research. As you said, it sounds like there's just a handful of people. Here we are running into all of these major figures. So this is Claire. This is a story that you discovered originally, correct?
Well, I mean, the very first thing was this incredible document that the Museum Raynham Hall had purchased at auction. It's a Bible, and written in the back end papers were a list of names and dates of birth and sometimes dates of deaths of the enslaved people of Robert's father, Samuel Townsend. That was like a revelation. We didn't even know the family owned any enslaved people. But by the time my research reached the book, I had found 20 enslaved people there in that household. And so it was just maybe people were overlooking these records in the past, or maybe just not wanting to learn more about them, but it had been overlooked. And so writing and working on that Bible led me to these letters that Robert had written to the men in Charleston. And then in another case, Adam Gilchrist's return letter to Robert about bringing her back up. Luckily, Robert put a lot of details into these letters, right? And then technology really helped too, because I'm sure your friends at History Camp know that you can really dig into old newspapers now in a way that you never could in the past. And so even as my research has gone forward in the 17 years, I find that I keep having to relook. I keep having to relook at everything, because the more you know and the more is digitized, it's like this constant stream of new documents are out there, and you can discover new things.
that to me is one of the most exciting things about the book, is that all the research that Claire did, I mean, this is all rooted in primary source documents.
Yeah.
So we really are able to reconstruct the story based on the individual's own words and own recollections. And that's part of what makes it so unique, is that this isn't a story that has kind of trickled down through other sources, that we really were able, Claire, through, meticulous research for, almost 2 decades, was able to reconstruct the story using letters and logbooks and, various documents from collections all over the US and Canada. So they were all, in all these disparate places, and, she was able to pull all these pieces together and weave it into, we realized how all the puzzle pieces fit.
And I'm still finding them, honestly.
Yes.
Well, I want to touch on one other thing, and then we're going to go to questions. And that's something that you mentioned before we got started, and your plans on bringing the story to a younger audience.
Yeah, education is so important. We only learn what we're taught. And until Liz's life was really fleshed out in this book, you didn't have a woman of color from the era of the Revolution that you could focus on, that you could see a life through her eyes. And so Tiffany and I are collaborating now on a middle school version of this book that we'll call Remember Liz. And that new book and a curriculum that we're working on through this new foundation will create a real archive and a toolbox for teachers, so that students and adult students too can really dig into this story in more effective ways. Not that this book isn't a page turner. I recommend this to all high school students, really, and all college students. But for those younger grades, the 4th graders, the 5th graders, we want to make a more accessible version for them.
Well, and it's so interesting that individuals that they would have perhaps already learned about, at least one or two, right, will show up in the story.
Oh, for sure.
And so making it easier to make those connections and so on. Well, this has been so interesting. Carrie, do you want to join us and join us with questions from people who've been watching tonight?
Okay, our first question is about the stats that we showed at the beginning. Do the Massachusetts stats include Maine, because Maine was not a separate state at that time, but part of Massachusetts?
That is a great question that I don't know the answer to.
All right.
But that's a good one. I would say that whatever was Massachusetts colony, that's what they were.
Probably counted, yeah.
Right. Okay, perfect. All right. So, Claire, we wanted to ask you about some new information. You have recently uncovered even more information about Liz and about her sister, Hannah. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's so hard to even understand that a person could own another person, right? Like, just to try to conceive of that you could own a person. And there are a couple of different ways that you could own a person, right? Like, you could purchase them at auction. That's kind of the one we think of first. They could just be born. If you owned an enslaved woman and she had a child, you then owned that child. You could also be given a person as a gift. You could inherit a person. That's really hard to think about too, right? But now I want to introduce another idea that I just recently discovered. I believe that Liz and her sister Hannah were not just enslaved by Robert's father, but that she was part of an inheritance that came down from his father, an inheritance that split these women between 4 brothers. And if you've ever studied estates, old estates and inventories, it is not so unusual that a singular enslaved person might be split between heirs. So they all effectively owned 1/4 of each of these women. Now, if that's true, and I found this in 2 of his brothers, one brother's heir is saying, I give up my proportion or right of Elizabeth and Hannah willed to be by my father. So this Martha Townsend is saying, I am no longer owning my portion of these 2 women. I manumit that portion of them, right? They're still not totally free, but that part is gone. The part that Robert controlled, his part was also gone. And then this other brother Dr. James Townsend, who had already died many years before, his heirs in 1803 are finally completely manumitting these two women. So I believe that Liz and her sister were legally freed in 1803 through the existing estate of one of these four brothers that still had an interest in them. Now, I don't think that that contradicts what we wrote in the book. I think that she was given a more casual freedom. This often happened. Slaves would be freed by their masters and would live as free people, but they wouldn't have their freedom certificate, their legal freedom certificate. So sometimes you'll see in manumission records, freed by my master, now desiring to be freed under the law. That was very important because if you didn't have that certificate, you could be re-enslaved and your children could be re-enslaved. Mm-hmm. And so in this same manumission of 1803, we see that Hannah, her sister, has just had a baby boy, and he is going to then be given some paperwork that could help him to become free as well. It's complicated. And after you read the book, you'll understand a little bit more. But I do believe that they were co-owned.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you one quick question. So, in our minds, it's easy to kind of think you want to set a slave free. You just kind of maybe write something out. Can you kind of talk about what that actually entailed?
So prior to 1785, it was very expensive in New York. If you wanted to free a slave prior to that date, you had to give the town you lived in 200 pounds money, which was much more than the slave might even have cost. That was going to form like a social services fund in case they ever became indigent that was going to care for them. But what it really did was it placed a very high bar, a barrier, and then people just weren't freed because it was too expensive. After 1785, there were a couple townsmen that were called the overseers of the poor. You'd have to bring a slave before them, but they couldn't be a child and they couldn't be elderly. They had to be over 21 and under 50. And if they were in that middle age, then they had to prove. You had to prove you owned them. That could be tricky if they were born in your household. You had to prove their age. So you had to have some kind of document that said how old they were. You had to prove that they were well. They couldn't have a physical disability or be ill in any way. And they also had to prove that they could make a living, not just make money, but enough to sustain themselves completely, to be self-sufficient, which was a very, very high bar. You could have a skill, but maybe you can't prove that you can make money at that skill. So after 1799 in New York, all those ages got turned up. Women had to be 25 or older, and men had to be 28 or older. And that would be when they would be eligible to go before these men and prove all these things. So it was very tricky. If you were going to be freed and you had a young child, they weren't going to be freed with you. They were still enslaved.
Very interesting. Okay, we have another question from the audience. Do either of you have any tips or advice for someone who is beginning to extensively research New England slavery?
Boy, I would say don't depend on what is written in a description of a collection of papers. Mm-hmm. If you think that there's a family that's attached to the enslaved person that you're digging into, you should go to the archive where their papers are and meticulously read everything, because a lot of times there are wonderful, amazing records hidden inside ledger books, account books, letters, and they will not, that enslaved person will not be notated necessarily in the description.
I want to, as sort of a real world example of this, the letters that where this is running away is described were actually, for years and years, it was thought that they were talking about a cow. Yeah. And Claire was actually the person who was able to draw the connections to other papers and realize that lists referred to a human. Yeah. But because, they weren't looking through that lens, people didn't necessarily make the connections between the lists here and then, we see this over here. And so that's just it, is like, Claire said, that's so often when these letters or collections were described or put together, they were by folks who haven't made those connections or drawn those lines. Mm-hmm. And so I mean, like, again, just a real world example from this book itself of seeing that you actually have to actually get in there and read the letters yourself through that lens to see if you can then start making connections.
And I would also say keep meticulous records of everything that you're discovering, because it could be years before you find another thread. And you want to always have a record of where you found that other piece of evidence and what exactly attracted you to it, or what was significant about it.
Okay, perfect. Those are great tips. Thank you. This has been very interesting, and what an intriguing story that we've had tonight. So thank you. And we want to encourage everyone to check out the book. We have a link in the chat. There's obviously, as always, so much more in the book. And then we also have a link to their website that gives you like a fun timeline to look at and kind of really lays a lot of this out for you. So take a look at those. We are going to spotlight some of our volunteers. So let me just tell you, you get to see me and Lee every week on these history camp discussions. And tonight we want to tell you about some of the people who work behind the scenes for the pursuit of history in a volunteer capacity and do a lot of work to bring everything for you. So let me just first tell you about Donna Kiesling. Donna writes for our monthly newsletter, Pursuing History. She has always enjoyed history. And here is a picture of Donna. Donna has always enjoyed history and enjoyed visiting historic sites. But a few years ago, she went to Great Camp Sagamore in the Adirondacks, and she realized that she actually really loves history and is especially intrigued by the Gilded Age. After that fateful trip, Donna enrolled in a graduate-level museum studies program. After retiring from a career in high tech, she is now working at the Spelman Museum of Stamps and Postal History and writing articles for the Pursuit of History. She learns something new every month, and we hope that you do too. And Larissa Moran is a volunteer with the Pursuit of History since the very beginning. She's been with us pretty much every step of the way. And you may know her as History Dame on Twitter and Instagram, where she hosts History in Under a Minute. And Larissa joins us each week behind the scenes for history camp discussions. You would probably not know that she's here, but she is every single week, and we are so grateful for that. She is also a tireless help at all of our events and continues to be a pillar of support throughout the year in an ongoing way. Larissa grew up with a Civil War history buff, and so history was always around her. And as she became older, she learned more about her grandparents' service in World War II, and that really kind of intrigued her and got her into history herself. Her original love was the late 19th century through the 20th century. However, she has found that she's pulled in by all sorts of American history because each era is another piece to a much larger puzzle. For Larissa, history is the story of people over events. Events are what we memorize, but she likes to learn what led up to the events and how society responded. And all of it is breadcrumbs leading to the present.
Well, thanks to Donna and Larissa, and thanks to Carrie, who has put together every week an outstanding program and done the research, contacted the authors, the publishers, the publicists, and really given us a great opportunity every week to learn something interesting about history directly from the authors. This is the time of the year when we do an end of the year appeal. If you go to thepursuitofhistory.org, there is a button there for donate. We greatly appreciate the donations that enable us to continue to do these things, do these programs, and would also encourage you to reach out. Carrie or I, both of us, would be happy to talk with you about specific opportunities in the year ahead. We are hard at work on what we think might be some especially interesting activities in 2022, fingers crossed. So please join us in supporting financially and with time and encouragement. You can also tell your friends about History Camp and these History Camp discussions. Like us on Facebook, share the link to the live broadcast or the archives to your social media networks, and we greatly appreciate it. So next week, 2022, we'll be speaking with Tom McMillan about the Civil War friendship of Generals Winfield Scott Hancock and Louis Armistead and the Battle of Gettysburg. I'll leave you with one more fact, and that is that Carrie and I are going to hit the road pretty soon trying to research another history camp in the future. So thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Claire. What a fascinating story. Thanks,
you
everyone.
so much. It was great to join everybody today.
So much.
Great.
Thank you. Good night and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.